Thank you. The coronavirus has drastically altered the outlook for the European and world economy. It has also made this forecast particularly challenging. And so I want to thank the DG ECFIN for the excellent management of this challenge. Let me share with you 6 key messages emerging from this forecast. First, it is now quite clear that the EU has entered the deepest economic recession in its history. The EU economy is expected to contract by a record 7.4% this year, 7.7% in the euro area, more than in 2009. 2009 contraction was around 4.5%. In 2021, we expect a rebound of 6.1% in the EU and 6.3% in the euro area, not enough to fully make up for this year's loss. Second, both the recession and the recovery will be uneven. These aggregate figures mask considerable differences between countries. Third, inflation will also be significantly weaker. Consumer prices are expected to fall significantly this year, reflecting the sharp weakening of demand as well as the steep fall in oil prices. Fourth, unemployment is set to increase, though policy measures should limit its rise. The impact of the pandemic will be felt on the labor market, but timely and sizable policy measures from governments and EU institutions could help to limit job losses, but massive drop in hours worked are expected. Fifth, bold and necessary policy measures will cause public deficits and public debt to rise in 2020. Governments have reacted decisively to the pandemic by implementing fiscal measures aiming at limiting the social and economic damages. This will inevitably lead to a marked deterioration of public finances this year in all member states. Sixth, the risk to this outlook are exceptionally large, and unfortunately they are to the downside. So let's begin to describe this general situation. COVID-19 abruptly changed our previous outlook. Economic activity in the EU dropped by around 1/3, practically overnight. The disruption resulted in a series of shocks to demand, supply, industrial output, investment, trade, and capital flows. That said, once the pandemic is under control and containment measures can be progressively eased, the European economy should start to recover in the second half of this year. But given the severity of the economic fallout this year, our economy is not expected to have fully made up for these losses at the end of 2021. Output at the end of next year is set to be about 3% lower than expected in our autumn forecast. All demand components will be hit hard by the pandemic, except government consumption. There will be a sharp contraction in household consumption. Private consumption should recover gradually once containment measures are lifted, but this recovery is said to be incomplete. Restrictions in tourism, recreational cultural activities are set to remain for longer, and uncertainty about employment and income prospects will likely make households cautious about spending for some time. Business investment is likely to take a double-digit hit this year. European exporters could be faced with a sharp drop of global demand and the possible disruptions to the free movement of people, goods, and services. The global economy. The current pandemic is a truly global shock. Overall, global GDP is projected to contract by about 3% this year. Again, a sharper downturn than the one during the financial crisis. It is then expected to rebound by 5% in 2021. And global trade is expected to take an even sharper hit. World import volumes are likely to fall by more than 10% this year. The real-time indicators reveal this shock. The downturn was so abrupt that it was not easy to have hard data capturing the impact. However, data available at higher frequency, such as daily electricity demand and air traffic, confirm completely the exceptional drops in activity in March as Europe locked down. And also survey data point to a sharp decline in activity. Flash indicators available for April reveal the magnitude of the downturn. The collapse is particularly visible for services and reflects the halt to travel, tourism, and catering, while the declines in the manufacturing and construction have been somewhat less sharp. They also point to a record contraction. Financial market resilience has been tested. The shock led to a sudden repricing of risks in March. In Europe, equities and high-yield corporate bonds saw the fastest sell-off in a century. This reflected the deterioration of the economic outlook, profitability prospects, and the severe liquidity dry-up that companies suddenly faced. In euro area sovereign debt markets, the outbreak brought an increase in spreads, pointing to investors' concern that the crisis could lead to divergences in the euro area and that the policy response be insufficient. The monetary and fiscal policy response globally and in the EU has been swift and strong. Unprecedented measures have been taken to contain the economic fallout and ease liquidity pressures. And these policies helped stabilize markets in April. So spreads narrowed for corporates and sovereigns, and equity markets recovered part of their losses. The outbreak has also completely changed the prospects for the European labor market. The confinement has led to a massive drop in hours worked. Policy measures taken to mitigate the labor market include short-time work schemes, wage subsidies for the self-employed, and liquidity measures for firms. These should help work to resume smoothly once restrictions can be relaxed. Assuming that these measures are effective, the fall in employment this year is expected to be more moderate than the decline in output, and more moderate than in other parts of the world, if we look, for example, to the US. This will leave the number of employed people in the EU about 1% below the one reached in 2019. The EU unemployment rate is expected to increase from 6.7% last year to about 9% this year. But behind this unemployment rate, don't forget that we will have a massive drop in hours worked. Governments have provided, as you know, sizable state guarantees for loans to firms and other liquidity support worth 22% of GDP. EU initiatives are complementing these liquidity measures for an additional 4.4% of EU GDP. These decisions are helping to avoid that firms' liquidity shortages evolve into a solvency crisis. Sizable discretionary fiscal measures have also been taken or announced at EU level for a total of 0.4% for EU and 3.2% of GDP for member states. As a result, the aggregate fiscal stance for both the euro area and the EU is expected to be very expansionary in 2020. Meanwhile, the ECB's broad range of easing measures taken in response to the crisis are expected to keep real short and long-term interest rates clearly in the negative territory over the forecast horizon. During the lockdown, as far as inflation is concerned, during the lockdown, some supply chain disruptions may result in temporary increases in certain prices. We have already seen this in the April increase in the prices of unprocessed food. But these effects are likely to be outweighed by a lack of demand, translating into lower domestic price pressures. Hence, core inflation is forecast to decrease this year and pick up only gradually next year. Overall, inflation in the euro area is projected at 0.2% this year and 1.1% in 2021. In the EU, inflation is forecast to reach 0.6 this year and 1.3 next year. A common crisis, as the one we were affected by, will have different economic consequences. How well countries emerge from this crisis will depend on the severity of the pandemic and the stringency of their containment measures. And it will also depend on their openness and their exposure to sectors that have been hit the most. Above all, the size of the policy support they undertake will be key. By the end of 2021, according to our forecast, only Germany, Austria, Croatia, Slovakia, and Poland are forecast to recoup the level of economic activity seen in the last quarter of 2019. By contrast, the level of output in Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands is forecast to remain more than 2% below the end 2019 level. Investment are likely to contract substantially. Faced with heightened uncertainty about future sales prospects, firms are likely to postpone or even cancel their investment plans. As it is the case for the economic activity as a whole, an incomplete and asymmetric investment recovery is expected across the Union next year. What is something about the map of European growth in 2020? As I told before, all EU member states are forecast to endure a severe recession this year. Economic activity in Greece, Italy, Spain, Croatia, and to a lesser extent France are forecast to contract the most. Among the largest member states, Italy was struck first and most forcefully. The economy is expected to contract by about 9.5%, with containment measures now starting to be removed gradually. The economy is projected to start recovering from the second half of 2020. Nevertheless, Italy's recovery is forecast to take longer than in other member states. The pandemic has hit the Spanish economy about as strongly as the Italian one. Real GDP is forecast to contract by almost 9.5% this year, with a sharp contraction in investment. Despite annual growth expected at 7% next year, Spain's recovery is set to be incomplete. In France, the economy is expected to shrink by about 8% this year. The economy is forecast to start recovering gradually in the second half of 2020, and as for most member states, France is set to be supported by fiscal measures aimed at ensuring firms' liquidity and protecting employment. Finally, Germany is expected to endure a less steep contraction than most member states and recover faster to pre-pandemic outputs level. Still, Germany is set to experience its deepest recession since the war at 6.5% in 2020. The lack of demand and disruptions in value chains should severely hamper the country's export. So the aggregate, coming to the budgetary outlook, the aggregate fiscal deficit is expected to surge, and to surge from 0.6% of GDP in 2019 to about 8.5% of GDP in both the euro area and the EU, from 0.6 to 8.5. In 2021, the deficit then forecast to decrease at around 3.5% in both areas due to the expected economic rebound and the cancelling of most of the measures. Consequently, the euro area debt to GDP ratio is projected to peak close to 103% in 2020, after having decreased for 5 consecutive years. It should decrease by about 4 percentage points, so to be around 100%, a little bit less, next year, based on a no policy change assumption. Let me stress that without these decisive but costly policy actions to contain the pandemic and limit the economic impact, the long-term budgetary impact of the current crisis would be worse. The most severely hit countries are forecast to reach double-digit deficit ratios in 2020, namely Italy and Spain, while France should be close to 10% of GDP. Deficit in Belgium, Poland, Slovakia, and Romania are expected to exceed the EU average deficit at over 8% of GDP. On the other side of the spectrum, in Ireland, Sweden, Hungary, Luxembourg, and Bulgaria, deficits should remain below 6% of GDP. Let me conclude on the risk, unfortunately, to this forecast. I say unfortunately because these risks are mostly concentrated on the downside. A prolonged or more severe spread of the virus would yield on an even worse downturn. Containment measures would have to be maintained or reinstated, further damaging the economy and the rebound that we are forecasting for 2021. So first of all, the evolution of the outbreak. Moreover, financial turmoil cannot be excluded if the liquidity shock hurting the corporate sector leads to unexpectedly severe solvency problem. Third, the recovery could suffer from insufficiently coordinated national policy responses or a too limited common EU response. This would increase economic, social, and financial divergence, and this would lead to serious distortions to the single market and our economy and monetary union. And finally, the pandemic could also trigger more drastic changes in attitudes towards global value chains and international trade and cooperation, leading to a rise in protectionism. These are the downside risks of our forecast. But let me end with two more optimistic messages. so to say, two upside risk to our forecast. First, the Commission is continuing to prepare further steps of our common response by acting together with a strong, well-financed and coordinated recovery plan. We can mitigate the impact of the crisis and strengthen our rebound. And second, given the huge efforts undertaken at the global and EU levels to develop a vaccine, a faster than anticipated return to a more normal economic situation would lead for sure to a more benign outcome than the forecast here. So thank you, and I'm ready to answer to your question.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We will now take your questions. There is interpretation available in German, English, French, Italian, and Spanish, so you can listen to questions in those languages, but I would ask you to answer either in English or French, please. With that, we will start with Athanasios. If I could ask you, please, to always mention the media for which you are asking the question. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Athanasios, Star Channel, Greece. The question is on the impact this forecast is going to have to the enhanced surveillance of Greece and the program targets in general, and I mean beyond 2021. What's going to happen with the long-term sustainability of the Greek debt? What are you going to do? What are you planning for the long-term sustainability of the Greek debt? And in this context, and since the country cannot achieve some of the targets due to the extraordinary circumstances, how do you plan to answer to the ANFA and S&P profits request that's going to happen in the Eurogroup around June? Are you going to disperse those profits no matter what the outcome is, or are they going to be deferred for the future? Thanks.
Well, thank you. As you know, Greece will benefit from the same flexibility as other member states under the general escape clause. And this was made clear by the Eurogroup statement in March and by the ECOFIN a week later. Obviously, this means that the target previously set for this year is no longer feasible. Second point, we believe that the Greece debt is sustainable, and since the onset of the crisis, Greece has successfully issued treasury bills and long-term bonds, indicated sustained access to market financing. Third point, yes, we will have this discussion on investment in the next Eurogroup.
Okay, thank you very much.
Not in June, as planned.
Okay, thank you very much. I now move to David Carretta. David, tu as la parole.
Yes. Thank you, Eric, and good morning, Commissioner. David Carretta, Radio Radicale. Two questions, if I may. The first one is on Italy. Do you think that the Italian government should be more ambitious or less prudent, I would say, in terms of fiscal response? And should the government take advantage of the ESM credit line to shift some of the national spending from healthcare and prevention costs to other sectors like direct support to companies and households? And the second question on the German Constitutional Court ruling. There are potential repercussions both in a political term with Poland that is already saying that it will not respect EU court rulings, and of course in a financial stability term with the 3-month deadline. Is an infringement procedure a possibility to deal with these issues? Thank you.
Thank you. On the Italian situation, I think we all know that Italy was hit by this outbreak in a very hard way. It was first in having to decide some difficult measures, and so lockdown measures started earlier than in other member states, and the consequences on economy were very, very sharp. At the same time, as you can see in our forecast, we are forecasting a rather strong rebound in the second half of this year and in 2021. I think that the measures that the government has taken are helping to go in this direction, and I think that the government is the one to decide on the enhanced credit line of the ESM. We, as a Commission, will only state the eligibility, and as you know, the eligibility will be communicated tomorrow to the Eurogroup for all member states. Then it will be to member states to decide if use the credit lines or not. And as you know, in Italy, there is a discussion on the subject, but it's not for the Commissioner to give particularly opinions. On the Karlsruhe court decision, as Eric Mamer just said, we discussed in the college after the report from the legal service, and I think that we have two very clear points. We reaffirm the primacy of the EU law. The rulings of the European Court of Justice are binding on all national courts. And second, we have always respected and we fully support the independence of the ECB in its implementation of monetary policy. Then we will study this national judgment in more detail to take for further discussion.
Okay, thank you. We now move to Jorge Valero.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Jorge. Hi. Please state your media again.
Jorge Valero, you're active. So two questions as well on Spain. The first one is that the deficit will be above almost 7% next year, and the debt level will be around 115%. So my question is, when do you believe that the Spanish government will start to adjust their spending, both, for example, in terms of raising taxes or implementing cuts? And a second question related to what David asked you about the ESM. Even though the role of the Commission maybe is not to issue guidance on this or recommend the use of the ESM, still maybe for various reasons, do you believe that the ESM is an attractive option for countries like Spain, Italy, that will see their public finances so hardly impacted by the coronavirus?
As far as the economic situation in Spain, as I said before, Spain was obviously one of the 3 or 4 most affected countries in Europe from this outbreak, and this is something that needs our solidarity and that needs from the government strong and quick decisions. And it is not usual that the European Commissioner for Economy invite countries to spend, but this was the case in the last couple of months. consequences of not spending, not intervening, I am not judging the quality of this intervention, would have been worse than the consequences that we will have because of high deficit and high debt ratio. Then we will have a period, obviously, to regain the proper road. But to face the crisis, and especially to face the risk of losing jobs and unemployment in Spain, I think is absolutely necessary. On the ESM, I think that for sure it is an opportunity for member states. We discussed this for maybe 16 hours in the Eurogroup, and we wouldn't have done this if we were not convinced that this could be an opportunity. We are concentrating, as you know, on healthcare issues, and different member states also with different interest rates in their access to market can be more or less interested. So it is sure that countries with higher interest rates could be more interested than others, but this again is for single member states to decide.
Thank you. We now move to Maria Psara. Maria. You have the floor. Go ahead. Yes. We can see you, but we cannot hear you.
About now?
Yes, fantastic.
Okay, fantastic. It's on Greece again. First of all, Maria Psara with Euronews and Open TV Greece. Two questions, if I may. You foresee the biggest recession for 2020 for Greece. Have you taken into account all the measures that the Greek government has already implemented in your report? And then there are discussions on the law on the first residence protection. What would be the suggestion by the Commission? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. We, in the forecast, we had a cutoff date that was the April 23rd. So we considered all measures implemented or announced, I mean, seriously announced before 23rd of April. This is not only for Greece, obviously, but for all member states. And second, yes, on the specific issue you were mentioning, I am aware of the discussion going on for the possible postponement of a short period of the decision to close with this measure, and the Commission is continuously in contact with Greek authorities to and with the ESM to agree on this path.
Okay, thank you. We now move to Mark Peppercorn.
Yes, good morning still, Mark Peppercorn.
Yes, not very well, Mark. If you want to put your earpiece on, you'll hear better. Make sure that your microphone is well oriented and close enough. Go ahead, Mark. Excellent.
Like this better? Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to know, I mean, in the report, actually there are three scenarios. The Commission chooses for the most optimistic scenario, which says 8% contraction. The other two scenarios go from 10 to 15% contraction. Can you explain to me why the Commission chose the most optimistic scenario? Thanks.
Well, not because I'm particularly optimistic in myself, but because this is our baseline scenario. As you know, all forecasts have either a baseline scenario with possible downside risks, or two different scenarios, and you can choose among them. The ECFIN decision, which is, by the way, our tradition, is to have a forecast, which is our central forecast, and then, as you rightly observed, we have different and more negative scenarios. I also mentioned possible more positive scenarios, but these are connected to policy action or vaccine, and it is difficult to have an economic forecast until you don't have a vaccine, you don't have the policy action in place. What is justifying the worst scenario? Mostly, with all their consequences, the possibility of a different evolution of the pandemic. Because our baseline scenario is assuming that since May, we are going to a gradual, not clear, but gradual, with some possible local difficulties, deconfinement in overall European situation. Then we have two negative scenarios, one based on a more serious outbreak coming in the next months and obliging countries to new containment measures. And the second is a real second wave in autumn and winter, causing something not so different from what we experienced in the last couple of months. You know that the scientific community is not clearly indicating what the evolution will be, but we are basing our forecast in the more possible also pandemic evolution, which is the evolution of a gradual containment of the outbreak.
Thank you. I have many, many hands raised. We will not be able to take all the questions, but we'll take a few more. I have Nilas. Nilas, you have the floor. Please state from which media you're asking the question. Yes, we can hear you.
Nilas Heinsgaard, Politiken, Denmark. There is a big difference in how much state aid the member states can inject in the economies. This has led to worries about unfair competition and weaker economic recovery because some member states have less capacity to support. Do you share these worries, and how can the recovery instrument take these into account?
Yes, for sure. The different level of the requests that were received by the DG Competition on their temporary framework for state aid shows that we have the risk of hurting the level playing field in our single market, because there are big differences. The common European response that we are working on and that we will present in the next weeks, the so-called recovery plan, etc., will also deal with a potential pan-European tool to face these risks. I think this is one of the possible common European tools to face the risk for European companies. We are discussing on the possibility of an intervention of a pan-European tools also on equities, what kind of companies, etc., etc. This, I think, could be a good tool to rebalance the risk of these imbalances.
Thank you. Now pass the floor to Oliver Grimm.
Hi, hello. Hello, Commissioner. Oliver Grimm here with the Austrian newspaper Die Presse. Two questions. First of all, can you explain why the recession is not as bad in the non-EU Eurozone member countries? So why is it worse in the Eurozone? And secondly, if I understood you correctly, you said Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands are the only member states where economic activity will be 2% lower than at the end of 2021 than it was at the end of 2019. Why are the Netherlands hit so hard? And does that play into the debate, in your view, about how to deal with the recovery fund? Thank you.
Well, yes. Yes, well, the difference between Euro area and EU in general is, I think, not particularly high, and it is connected to a different level of previous different level of the economic situation, and also on the fact that the most affected countries are not overall, because we have differences. We have also non-Euro area countries very affected, but the bigger one are in the Euro area. But it is not such an important difference. Well, in the forecast for 2021 recovery, the countries you mentioned, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands, were particularly in my presentation because they are not at the same level of 2019, more than 2%, but many other countries, unfortunately, will not recover the level of the end of 2019. Despite for a lower level. For the Netherlands, what is very, very important is that the contraction this year will not be among the stronger in the Euro area. It will be 6.8%, but the recovery projection, the recovery forecast, the rebound forecast takes note of some aspects connected to the exposure to world trade that are particular of this economy.
Thank you. We now move to Susanna Freixes.
Thank you. Susanna Freixes, SIC. Okay. Do you listen to me now? Yeah.
Yes, more or less. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Susanna Freixes, SIC in Portugal. Commissioner, I would like to ask you, why are you less pessimistic than, for instance, the IMF for Portugal specifically? Because we see that Commission's figures are really less pessimistic either for deficit, recession, debt. Why is it so when we see that the impact in the tourism sector was so bad? And
Susanna, hold on. We can hear you really quite badly. Did I understand well that your question was related to the fact that our forecasts are less pessimistic than those from the IMF?
Yes, okay. Exactly, for Portugal.
Okay, let's focus on that first, and in the meantime, try to fix your microphone.
Yes, this is not only for Portugal, but we have to consider that the IMF forecast had a cutoff date previous than the one of the Commission. This brings to different assessment for several countries, also because when we cut off our forecast, April 23rd, situation of the curve of the outbreak was more clear than when IMF made its forecast. So it was not positive, 23rd of April, but it was already clear in most of member states that the peak had been already reached and the curve was changing. And this allowed us to make a different forecast. As far as Portugal is concerned, by the way, our projection appears more optimistic than the IMF, but more pessimistic than the consensus economic forecast and the Banco de Portugal baseline and adverse scenarios published in late March. So we are in the middle, IMF and the consensus economics forecast.
You had a second question, Susanna.
If I may, on the tourism sector, I'd like to hear you, because do you already see any evidence that the sector will survive the summer? Well, mainly, of course, I'm asking in Portugal, but in the southern countries as well.
Well, we have to work to make sure that this sector will survive the summer, despite the fact that we know that it will survive the summer in different conditions than the one that we had last summer, obviously. And the Commission is working hard on this. It will be one of the main issues of the next college next week, because we have to try to indicate guidelines and, when possible, rules to coordinate the situation, because we have different type of tourism, obviously, and we have countries like Portugal and others that are more exposed, especially to foreign tourism. And this is something that has to do with aviation, with borders, and with many issues that the Commission will deal with. But definitely, yes, tourism has to survive next summer, and we will work for this.
Okay, thank you. We move to Anna Slojewska.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi, this is Anna Slojewska, Polish Daily Rzeczpospolita. Commissioner, I would like to ask you about Poland. In your forecast, Poland is the least hit country this year. I'm just wondering why. That's true that Poland is one of the least hit countries by the pandemic itself, but the lockdown measures were quite tough. So what makes you think that the recession will not be that hard as in other EU countries? Thank you very much.
Obviously, the first answer is that the forecast is based not only because there are several other factors in the model, but mainly based in the consequences of the outbreak and of the lockdowns. We would never have had a recession of 7 point something at the EU average and near to 10% in some countries without this outbreak and without lockdown. So the main reason is that this outbreak affected countries and also regions of countries in different ways, And this is the more easy answer to your question. I wouldn't say, in any case, that Poland is completely affected by consequences. For example, there is an increase in unemployment rate, and this is not the only Eastern country that will have this. And this is connected both to the fact that unemployment were very low in some of these countries, and also to the fact that labor market is more flexible than in other European countries. So we have a forecast for Poland of an unemployment rate going from 3.3 to 7.5, which is a number.
Okay, thank you. I now move to Sam Fleming from the FT. Sam.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Commissioner. You say in the report that firms are likely to be postponing or cancelling investment plans given all the uncertainty that there is out there. That backdrop is clearly relevant to the Commission's ambitions to trigger private investments via guarantees in the upcoming recovery plan. How do you balance the concern that there just isn't going to be the demand amongst the private sector to invest with the ambitions and the multipliers that the Commission wants to see in that recovery plan? And on an allied point, some member states are obviously arguing that back-to-back loans via this programme will be of limited help given how low borrowing costs are in the markets, which obviously you highlight in the report as well. How do you respond to those concerns? Thank you.
Well, yes. A shortfall of private investment, because we are not seeing an enormous shortfall in public investments, at least not in 2020, but we are seeing a shortfall in private investment. By the way, if you live in Europe and you have contacts with companies, you can understand that it is frequent that investment in this moment, not in all sectors, but in several sectors, are freezed or postponed. And this is the situation we will have to face. And so we will for sure take note of this situation when discussing and proposing the new MFF and the recovery plan, the recovery fund, etc. We know that we are in a more challenging situation as far as private investments are concerned. On grants and loans, this is a very controversial issue, but at the end, I don't think so controversial. I think that at the end, the President clarified this just after the European Council when she said we will have a mix of grants and loans in our proposal. For sure, grants are absolutely important in some more affected sectors and geographical areas, but loans are very important depending on their maturity. It's not the same thing if you have a loan for 2 years or for 40 years. So this is the mix we are working on.
This is probably the right point in time to move to Griselda Pastor. Griselda.
Merci beaucoup. Si vous m'entendez,
On t'entend très bien.
Merci. Je voudrais poser des questions. Bonjour, Monsieur le Commissaire. La première, c'est que je ne comprends pas trop bien les données du chômage, mais j'aimerais bien savoir pourquoi, face à des situations de tombée de la croissance plus ou moins similaires, l'Espagne, l'Italie, la France, on a des données si terribles pour l'Espagne et moins mauvaises, même si elles le sont, pour l'Italie ou la France. Et après, j'aimerais savoir, puisque vous présentez ces données sans avoir la garantie encore de ces fonds de récupération, on a le sentiment que les divisions perdurent. J'aimerais savoir quelle est votre position face à ces débats et si vous considérez quand même urgent pouvoir présenter le plus tôt possible une proposition qui puisse soulager la situation.
Oui. Dans notre prévision, on tient compte des systèmes, des différents schèmes qui sont en place dans les différents pays pour aider les différents pays à conserver le travail et pas seulement à aider le chômage. Et deuxièmement, on considère aussi ce qu'on a déjà décidé, y compris le Fonds européen de SURE, qui est en train d'être défini dans les détails, mais qui a été déjà décidé par l'Eurogroupe et par les chefs d'État et de gouvernement. Oui, il y a une différence qui n'est pas énorme, mais il y a une différence entre l'Espagne, l'Italie et la France. Plus ou moins, il y a entre 2 points plus de unemployment en Italie et en France et plus que 4 points en plus en Espagne. Et cela dépend des différents systèmes et aussi des différents points de partance, point de départ, parce que naturellement, le point de départ de la France, qui est 8%, n'est pas le même de l'Espagne, qui est déjà 14%. Mais je veux répéter ce que j'ai dit auparavant, et c'est qu'on ne doit pas seulement regarder le unemployment rate, parce que, spécialement dans les pays où ces mécanismes de travail partiel sont là, on n'aura pas formellement du chômage, mais on aura une réduction des heures travaillées et une réduction de l'argent dans la poche des travailleurs. Et alors, sur le plan social, il ne faut pas imaginer que le unemployment rate nous donne la description du choc qu'on aura, parce qu'on a beaucoup plus de chocs de ce qui montre ce taux de chômage.
Okay, 3 last questions and then we'll finish. David Herschenhorn.
Thanks very much, Eric. Commissioner David Herschenhorn with Politico. I wonder if, given the dire forecast that you've laid out, describing a historic downturn, if in fact, in your opinion, the financial markets where we haven't seen a historic downturn are reacting rationally to everything that you see. And also, if you could, given the unevenness in the recovery and the rebound that you've described, how worried are you that some of the countries in the EU, in the Eurozone, that will recover faster or that are not hit as hard, especially some of the countries in the north known as fiscal hawks by reputation, that they will get in the way of doing what is necessary to speed this recovery along? How much proof do we see here that since the financial crisis, the EU just never quite got its house in order to be able to respond as one to a crisis like this?
Well, thank you for your question. I am rather confident for a simple reason that my understanding is that the awareness of the fact that we are in a completely different scenario from the one we were in the financial crisis is growing. If I look back to 2 months ago, 1 month ago, 2 weeks ago, this awareness was more limited. Is this only human solidarity? Well, I am not dismissing human solidarity. Human solidarity is a very important and European sentiment. But I think it is economic awareness. I think that all reasonable governments and public servants have cleared the fact that we are risking some fundamental things like the level playing field in our single market, the convergence in the euro area, and others. And then if we lose or we fragilize these things, the consequences will not be for the frugal or the southern, the eastern, or the western. The consequences will be very, very bad for all Europeans. So if we had a forward-looking discussion and not a backward-looking risk sharing, risk prevention, all the discussion that we heard in the last 10 years, but we have a discussion on how to help our economy to rebound. And to help them, we need common tools, because it is not sufficient to enable member states. I think the awareness of this is clearer, and this is why I am rather confident that we will have a good proposal.
All right, the two last questions. First, Naomi O'Leary, and then Tommaso Galavotti. Naomi, you have the floor. If you can hear us. Okay, we will move then perhaps first to Tommaso and see. Tommaso, you have the floor.
Yeah, good morning, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Tommaso. Go ahead.
Okay, good morning, Commissioner. Just two questions, if I may. The first one is on the timing for the proposal on the recovery instrument or recovery fund, as you want to call it. Can you confirm that it is envisaged on the second or the third week of May, and are you confident that the European Council might approve it in June? And the second question, if I may, is on the ESM, because we have learned from a document forwarded to the Dutch Parliament that the credit lines actually will foresee the signing of a memorandum of understanding by member states, although very light. But I wonder if you can exclude that this technical feature could enable the application of the so-called ex-post conditionality, which is foreseen by the two-pack. Thank you so much.
Well, our plan and its funding will be decided in the next weeks. It's not to me to decide when. We are working hard, and it is not an easy job. But for sure, in the next weeks, I use the S because I can't say next week, but next weeks for sure. And I am confident that the Council will approve with all the discussion that is needed, and it is obvious from the Council and Member States this proposal, because if we will have this on the table, perspective would be much more reassuring than the one we are discussing. I would not say the same if we will not have this, because we will have for sure consequences. So I am confident that in June it will be approved. As far as the ESM is concerned, we will send to member states in view of the Eurogroup, which is convened for Friday, a package from the Commission with all what is needed for the eligibility, for the debt assessment. You know that eligibility will be for all countries, and debt assessment will be positive for all countries. and with the rules, because we made great effort also with the legal service to have rules that are respecting what the political decisions of finance ministers and head of state of government was. And the decision was that the conditionality was not the traditional conditionality, but very restricted to the scope of these credit lines.
Okay, we tried Naomi one last time, and that will be in any case the last question. Naomi, you have the floor. We cannot hear you. You may have another opportunity at the technical briefing. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for having taken this time to answer these questions. We now move to the technical briefing, so stay connected with colleagues who will be connected, in fact, remotely as well from DG ECFIN, and which will be moderated by my colleague Marta. Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow.
And stay tuned.
Stay tuned and stay connected.